The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky outcropping as staff. Sergeant Jessica Carter pressed her eye to the Schmidt and Bender scope, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. 2 kilometers below her position, 8 Navy SEALs from DEVGRU Team Bravo were pinned down behind a crumbling stone wall, their situation deteriorating by the minute. The Barrett M107A1 felt familiar in her hands, its weight distributed perfectly across the bipod. She'd positioned with mathematical precision on the jagged rocks of the Moldanistan mountain ridge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Commander Marcus Stone's voice, tight with frustration. Overwatch, we've got 0 visibility on the primary target. Dust storms kicking up and thermals are useless through this interference. We need that shot now. Jessica adjusted her scope's magnification, switching between thermal and optical modes as she scanned the village of Ashkaran spread out in the valley below. The ancient settlement looked peaceful enough in the early light, but intelligence had confirmed that Hassan Al-Rashid, one of the most wanted terrorist leaders in Central Asia, was holed up in the 3-story building at the village center. The same building that the SEAL team couldn't approach due to the overlapping fields of fire from concealed positions. The wind gauge on her rifle stock showed 15 knots from the southwest, gusting to 20. At 2,100 meters, environmental factors would affect bullet trajectory significantly. Jessica had made longer shots, but never with an entire SEAL team's lives depending on her precision. Never when the target was completely invisible to the assault force, but theoretically within her line of sight. Negative on target acquisition, she whispered into her throat mic. Building's got too much ambient heat signature. Can't distinguish individual targets through the thermal bloom. Stone's response carried the edge of desperation. Carter, we've got movement on the north ridge. Hostiles are flanking our position. If we don't neutralize Al-Rashid in the next 10 minutes, we're going to have to abort and extract under fire. Jessica had been attached to DEVGRU operations for 8 months, the first female Army Ranger to serve in direct support of SEAL Team 6 missions. Her presence hadn't been welcomed by everyone in the special operations community, but her record spoke louder than the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered briefing rooms. Expert marksman qualification for 4 consecutive years, successful completion of Army Ranger School, where she'd been one of only 3 women in a class of 87, and a confirmed kill record in Afghanistan that impressed even the most skeptical SEAL operators. The mission to eliminate Al-Rashid had been weeks in planning. Intelligence sources within Moldanistan's fractured government had provided his location, confirming that the terrorist leader was coordinating a major attack against the American embassy in neighboring Turkestan. The window of opportunity was narrow. Al-Rashid moved constantly, never staying in one location more than 72 hours, and this remote village represented the best chance to eliminate him before he disappeared back into the cave networks that honeycombed the border region. DEVGRU Team Bravo had inserted via helicopter at 0300, moving 12 kilometers through mountainous terrain to reach their assault position. Jessica had been deployed separately, establishing her Overwatch position on a ridge that provided commanding views of the target area but placed her nearly 3 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces. If something went wrong, she'd be completely isolated in hostile territory. The plan had been straightforward. The SEALs would conduct a direct assault on the building while Jessica provided precision fire support, eliminating any targets that threatened the assault team or attempted to escape. But the morning dust storm had reduced visibility to near 0 at ground level, making positive target identification impossible for the assault force. Overwatch to team leader, Jessica transmitted, studying the building through her scopes. Enhanced optics. I'm seeing thermal signatures consistent with multiple individuals. But the interference is making positive identification extremely difficult. Recommend we wait for weather conditions to improve. Stone's voice carried frustration and urgency. Negative. Intel confirms Al-Rashid is planning to move locations this afternoon. This is our only shot. Jessica understood the pressure. Special operations missions lived or died by precise timing and limited windows of opportunity. But taking a shot without positive target identification violated every rule of engagement she'd been trained to follow. The risk of civilian casualties was enormous, and international law required absolute certainty before engaging targets in populated areas. Through her scope, she could see the SEAL team's position becoming increasingly precarious. Muzzle flashes from surrounding buildings indicated that hostile forces were closing in from multiple directions. The 8-man team had enough firepower to defend their position temporarily, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition after the approach march. Petty Officer First Class Danny Brooks, the team's senior enlisted advisor, came up. On the radio, "Ma'am, we've got perhaps 15 minutes before our position becomes completely untenable. Whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen now." Jessica had worked with Brooks on 3 previous missions. The 20-year Navy veteran had initially been skeptical of working with female support personnel, but his attitude had changed after she'd eliminated a sniper team that had been targeting his patrol in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Brooks was one of the few SEALs who judged her purely on capability rather than gender. The thermal imaging revealed movement within the target building, but the heat signatures were indistinct blobs that could represent civilians, combatants, or Al-Rashid himself. Standard operating procedures required visual confirmation of the target before engaging, but the dust storm made that impossible. Jessica's training had emphasized the importance of following rules of engagement, regardless of battlefield pressure. Civilian casualties from American precision strikes had created diplomatic incidents that affected strategic relationships throughout the region. Every shot had to be legally and morally justifiable, particularly when fired by a sniper whose actions would be scrutinized by military investigators. But she could also hear the increasing volume of gunfire from the SEAL team's position. Stone's calm professional demeanor was beginning to crack under the pressure of command decisions that could result in American casualties. The team had perhaps 10 minutes before their tactical situation became hopeless. Jessica switched her scope back to optical magnification, hoping that improved weather conditions might provide the visual confirmation she needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dust was beginning to settle slightly as the morning wind patterns shifted, but visibility remained severely limited. Then she saw something that changed everything. A figure appeared briefly in the third-floor window of the target building, silhouetted against interior lighting for perhaps 2 seconds before disappearing back into the shadows. The height, build, and distinctive movement pattern matched intelligence photographs of Al-Rashid that Jessica had memorized during mission planning. Possible target acquisition, she transmitted. Third floor, northwest window. Brief visual contact consistent with primary objective. Stone's response was immediate. Confirm target identity. Jessica kept her crosshairs trained on the window, waiting for another glimpse of the figure. Intelligence had provided detailed physical descriptions of Al-Rashid, including facial features, scars, and distinctive clothing preferences. But the brief sighting had been insufficient for positive identification, according to standard protocols. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the valley, but they were coming from the wrong direction. Instead of American extraction aircraft, these appeared to be Moldanistan government forces responding to the firefight. If official military units arrived before the mission was complete, the diplomatic consequences could be severe. Multiple aircraft approaching from the south, Jessica reported. Estimate 10 minutes until arrival. The timeline was collapsing. Stone had to make a decision between aborting the mission and accepting the risk of civilian casualties from an unconfirmed shot. Jessica understood the mathematics of special operations warfare. Sometimes perfect information wasn't available, and commanders had to act based on incomplete intelligence and battlefield intuition. Through her scope, she saw the figure appear again in the window, this time remaining visible for nearly 5 seconds. The person was male, approximately the right height and build, wearing the style of traditional robes that Al-Rashid favored. But positive facial identification was still impossible due to distance and lighting conditions. Target reacquired, Jessica transmitted. Consistent with intelligence parameters, but visual confirmation remains incomplete. The SEAL team's defensive fire was becoming more sporadic as ammunition ran low. Brooks came back on the radio, his voice tight with professional concern. "Ma'am, we need immediate fire support or extraction. Current position is no longer sustainable." Jessica faced the defining moment of her military career. She could follow standard protocols and decline. To engage without positive target identification, potentially resulting in American casualties and mission failure. Or she could trust her training, experience, and the partial intelligence available to take a shot that might save 8 lives, but could also kill innocent civilians. The figure in the window raised what appeared to be binoculars, scanning the valley where the SEAL team was fighting for their lives. The posture and movements suggested tactical awareness rather than civilian curiosity. Someone coordinating defensive operations rather than an innocent bystander. Jessica's breathing slowed to the rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times on training ranges. The wind had decreased to 12 knots, steady from the southwest. Range was 2,087 meters according to her laser measurement. Temperature had risen 3 degrees since dawn, requiring minor ballistic adjustments. The crosshairs settled on center mass of the figure in the window. Her finger found the trigger's first stage, taking up the mechanical slack with the smooth pressure she'd perfected through years of precision shooting. The Barrett's .50 caliber round would cover the distance in approximately 2-3 seconds, carrying enough kinetic energy to eliminate any human target with a center mass hit. "Stone, I need authorization," Jessica transmitted. "Target presents consistent with primary objective, but confirmation remains incomplete per standard protocols." The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Stone's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Carter, you are authorized to engage at your discretion. Time is critical." Jessica understood what he was really saying. The decision was being placed entirely on her shoulders. If she was wrong, if the target turned out to be a civilian, she would bear complete responsibility for the consequences. But if she was right, 8 American warriors would go home to their families instead of becoming casualties in a remote mountain valley. The figure moved closer to the window, providing the clearest view Jessica had obtained. The profile matched intelligence photographs, and the tactical positioning suggested someone with military training rather than a random civilian. Every instinct developed through 7 years of military service and dozens of combat operations indicated that this was Al-Rashid. Jessica's finger completed the trigger pull with the inevitability of physics. The rifle's recoil drove against her shoulder as the .50 caliber round screamed across the valley, carrying with it the hopes of 8 SEALs and the weight of international law. Through her scope, she watched the impact. The figure in the window disappeared instantly, thrown backward by the massive kinetic energy of the heavy round. Glass exploded outward, and the interior of the room erupted in activity as other occupants scrambled for cover. "Target down," Jessica reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Clean hit center mass. Hostile eliminated." The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Defensive fire from surrounding buildings decreased significantly as command and control structures collapsed. The SEAL team began advancing toward the target building, their tactical situation transformed by the elimination of coordinating leadership. Stone's voice carried relief and professional approval. "Outstanding shooting, Carter. You just saved 8 American lives." But even as Jessica accepted the congratulations, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility that followed every long-range engagement. She'd made the shot based on partial information and tactical judgment, trusting her experience and training to make the right decision under impossible circumstances. The figure in the window had been eliminated with precision and professional competence, but positive identification wouldn't be confirmed until the SEAL team reached the building. Jessica had committed an act that would either be celebrated as exceptional marksmanship under extreme conditions or investigated as a potential violation of rules of engagement. As she watched the SEALs advance through her scope, Jessica reflected on the complexity of modern warfare where split-second decisions carried strategic consequences. She'd joined the Army to serve her country and protect American lives, but the realities of combat operations often required choices that existed in gray areas between clear right and wrong. The approaching helicopters were growing louder, their rotor signatures indicating heavy transport aircraft rather than attack helicopters. Moldanistan government forces would arrive within minutes, making extraction urgent. Jessica began disassembling her rifle, preparing for the movement to the extraction point that would take her away from this remote mountain ridge and back to the debriefing rooms, where her actions would be analyzed and judged. Stone's voice crackled through her radio one final time as the SEAL team reached the target building. Overwatch target confirmed. Primary objective eliminated. Outstanding work. The confirmation should have felt like vindication, but Jessica knew that exceptional performance under extreme pressure often attracted unwanted attention from military bureaucrats more concerned with policy compliance than mission success. She'd made the right tactical decision, but explaining that to investigators who'd never faced similar circumstances would be another challenge entirely. As she prepared to move from her firing position, Jessica couldn't know that the shot she'd just fired would soon become the center of a controversy that would threaten everything she'd worked to achieve in her military career. The same precision and judgment that had just saved 8 American lives would soon be questioned by people who measured success in terms of policy compliance rather than mission accomplishment. Parts 2 to 5. The Unraveling the Extraction Helicopters. Rotors beat a steady rhythm as Jessica Carter stared out the window at the mountainous terrain of Moldanistan disappearing below. Across from her, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Stone cleaned his weapon with methodical precision, occasionally glancing at the sealed evidence bags containing materials recovered from Al-Rashid's compound. The 8-man SEAL team occupied the aircraft's remaining seats, their faces showing the exhaustion that followed successful high-stakes operations. Petty Officer Danny Brooks leaned over to speak above the helicopter noise. "That was some shooting back there, Carter. 2,000 meters through dust and wind. Most snipers couldn't make that shot on a clear day." Jessica nodded but didn't respond. Professional compliments felt premature when she knew the shot would face intense scrutiny from military investigators. Every long-range engagement involving potential civilian areas triggered automatic reviews, and her decision to fire without complete visual confirmation would raise questions that went beyond tactical considerations. Stone approached her position, carrying a tactical tablet displaying preliminary battle damage assessment photos. Moldanistan government forces reached the compound 30 minutes after our extraction. Initial reports confirm Al-Rashid's death. Along with 4 associates, no civilian casualties identified. The confirmation should have provided relief, but Jessica understood that successful outcomes didn't automatically justify controversial tactical decisions. Military justice operated according to processes rather than results, and her engagement had occurred in circumstances that challenged standard protocols. What's the timeline for debriefing? Jessica asked. 48 hours. SOCAM wants a complete operational review before releasing mission reports to higher command. Stone's expression suggested he understood the implications. They're particularly interested in the decision-making process for your engagement. The helicopter landed at Forward Operating Base Meridian, a temporary facility established to support special operations in the region. Jessica gathered her equipment and followed the team toward the debriefing complex, aware that the next several hours would determine how her actions were officially characterized. The initial debriefing session took place in a sterile conference room equipped with recording equipment and secure communication systems. Major Patricia Reynolds, the SOCAM investigating officer, reviewed the mission parameters with clinical precision. Reynolds was known throughout the special operations community for thoroughness that bordered on obsession with regulatory compliance. Staff Sergeant Carter, Reynolds began, please describe the circumstances that led to your engagement of the target. Jessica provided a detailed account of the environmental conditions, tactical situation, and intelligence available at the time of her shot. She emphasized the time constraints, the SEAL team's deteriorating position, and the partial visual confirmation she'd obtained before engaging. Reynolds reviewed digital recordings of radio communications, studying the timeline with evident skepticism. According to these transcripts, you acknowledge that visual confirmation remained incomplete according to standard protocols. What factors influenced your decision to engage despite this limitation? The question struck at the heart of modern military operations. Rules of engagement were designed to minimize civilian casualties and comply with international law, but they often failed to account for the split-second decisions required in dynamic combat situations. Ma'am, the tactical situation required immediate action to prevent American casualties, Jessica replied. Based on available intelligence, target behavior patterns, and positioning, I assessed the probability of correct target identification as sufficient to justify engagement. Reynolds made notes on her tablet, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment. Staff Sergeant, are you familiar with Directive 3009 regarding autonomous weapon systems and human accountability in lethal force decisions? Jessica felt her stomach tighten. The directive established strict requirements for human judgment in lethal force applications, particularly in situations where positive target identification remained incomplete. Reynolds was suggesting that her engagement might have violated fundamental principles of military law. Yes, ma'am. I'm familiar with the directive. According to your testimony, you engaged a target without positive visual identification, based primarily on circumstantial indicators and tactical judgment. How do you reconcile this decision with requirements for human certainty in lethal force applications? The question revealed the philosophical tension at the center of modern warfare. Military technology allowed engagements at ranges and under conditions that made traditional identification methods impossible, but legal frameworks still demanded human judgment based on clear visual confirmation. Jessica chose her words carefully. Ma'am, human judgment encompasses the integration of multiple information sources, including intelligence preparation, target behavior analysis, and tactical context. My decision incorporated all available data to reach a conclusion that satisfied the legal and moral requirements for engagement. Reynolds continued the questioning for 2 hours, examining every aspect of Jessica's decision-making process with the intensity of a prosecutor building a case. The session concluded without indication of official findings, but Jessica understood that her military career now hung in the balance. Over the following days, additional investigation teams arrived at the Forward Operating Base. Military lawyers, intelligence analysts, and senior officers from various commands descended upon the remote facility to examine what had initially appeared to be a routine special operations success. The mood among DEVGRU personnel shifted as word spread that Carter's engagement was under formal investigation. SEALs who had celebrated her exceptional marksmanship began avoiding casual conversation, recognizing that their statements might be used in legal proceedings. Danny Brooks approached Jessica during evening chow, speaking in low tones to avoid attracting attention. Word is that Reynolds is recommending formal charges. Something about violation of rules of engagement and unauthorized lethal force. Jessica had been expecting this development, but still felt the impact like a physical blow. Military justice moved according to its own logic, where successful mission outcomes carried less weight than procedural compliance. "Any idea what the specific charges might be?" she asked. "Rumor mill says they're considering Article 86 for disobeying a lawful order, Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, maybe Article 118 if they decide to push the unlawful killing angle." The potential charges represented career-ending accusations that could result in imprisonment as well as discharge. Article 118, concerning unlawful killing, was particularly serious because it suggested criminal, rather than administrative misconduct. Lieutenant Commander Stone found Jessica in the communications center later that evening, reviewing after-action reports from previous missions. His expression carried the weight of command decisions that affected subordinates' lives. "Carter, I need you to understand something about this investigation. The questions they're asking aren't really about your shot. They're about the precedent your actions might establish for female personnel in combat operations." Jessica looked up from the reports, understanding immediately what Stone meant. Her case would be examined not only for its specific circumstances, but also for its implications regarding women in direct combat roles. "There are people in the Pentagon who never supported the integration of female personnel into special operations units," Stone continued. "They see this investigation as an opportunity to demonstrate that women make emotional rather than tactical decisions under pressure. The institutional politics surrounding gender integration in combat units had been contentious since policy changes began allowing women into previously restricted military occupational specialties. Jessica's case would inevitably become a proxy for broader debates about military effectiveness and social engineering. "Sir, my gender had nothing to do with the tactical decision I made in that valley. I know that, and everyone who's worked with you knows that. But the people making decisions about your future weren't there when you saved 8 American lives. They're going to evaluate your actions based on policy compliance and political considerations." Stone paused, weighing his next words carefully. "There's something else you should know. Colonel Richard Hayes has been assigned as senior investigating officer for the formal inquiry. Hayes has been vocal about his opposition to women in combat roles since the policy changes began." Jessica knew Hayes by reputation. The career infantry officer had testified before Congress against gender integration, arguing that physical and psychological differences made women unsuitable for direct combat operations. His appointment as investigating officer suggested that the inquiry would focus more on validating preconceived conclusions than determining objective facts. The formal charges were delivered 72 hours later, during a ceremony designed to emphasize the gravity of military justice. Jessica stood at attention in her dress uniform, while Major Reynolds read the specifications that would determine her future. "Staff Sergeant Jessica Carter, you are hereby charged with violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Article 86, failure to obey a lawful order. Article 118, murder in violation of the law of war, and Article 134, conduct of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces." The murder charge hit Jessica like a physical assault. Military prosecutors were alleging that her engagement of Al-Rashid constituted an unlawful killing because she'd fired without positive target identification. The legal theory suggested that her shot represented criminal homicide rather than legitimate military action. Captain Amanda Walsh, Jessica's appointed defense counsel reviewed the charges with barely concealed anger. "They're treating this like you randomly fired into a crowd instead of making a tactical decision to save American lives. The murder charge is prosecutorial overreach designed to force a plea agreement." Walsh was a military lawyer with extensive experience in combat-related cases. Her reputation for aggressive defense of military personnel had made her unpopular with command structures that prioritized institutional protection over individual rights. "What are options?" Jessica asked. "We fight. The government's case depends on portraying your decision as reckless rather than tactical. We'll demonstrate that your actions were consistent with military training, special operations doctrine, and the reasonable judgment of a qualified professional." The pre-trial preparation process revealed the scope of institutional forces aligned against Jessica. Prosecutor witnesses included senior officers who testified about the importance of strict adherence to rules of engagement, policy experts who explained the legal frameworks governing lethal force, and psychologists who offered opinions about decision-making under stress. The prosecution's strategy became clear during witness interviews. They would argue that Jessica's gender made her more likely to make emotional rather than rational decisions under pressure, that her attachment to the SEAL team compromised her professional judgment, and that her shot represented the kind of independent action that undermined military discipline. Colonel Hayes presided over pre-trial hearings with obvious bias. His questions focused repeatedly on Jessica's emotional state during the engagement, the personal relationship she'd developed with SEAL personnel, and her motivations for making decisions that contradicted explicit protocols. "Staff Sergeant Carter," Hayes said during one particularly hostile exchange, "isn't it true that your attachment to the men you were supporting clouded your professional judgment?" Walsh immediately objected to the question's implication that professional relationships somehow compromised tactical decision-making. "Colonel, the question assumes facts not in evidence and incorporates irrelevant gender stereotypes." Hayes overruled the objection with visible irritation. "The witness will answer the question." Jessica understood that Hayes had already reached his conclusions about her case. "Sir, my decision was based on tactical assessment of available intelligence and the military necessity of protecting American personnel. Personal relationships played no role in my evaluation of the engagement criteria." The pre-trial process continued for weeks, with each hearing revealing more clearly the institutional determination to use Jessica's case as an example for other female personnel considering combat roles. Defense motions were routinely denied. Prosecution witnesses were given extensive latitude to offer speculative testimony, and media coverage began portraying the case as a referendum on women in combat. Military Times published articles questioning whether female personnel possessed the emotional stability required for life-and-death decisions. Defense blogs argued that Jessica was being scapegoated for policy decisions made by senior leadership. Feminist organizations claimed her prosecution represented institutional misogyny disguised as military justice. The media attention transformed Jessica's case from a routine military legal proceeding into a national controversy that attracted congressional interest. Senators began demanding briefings on the circumstances surrounding the charges, and advocacy groups organized protests outside military installations. Jessica found herself at the center of debates she'd never wanted to join. She'd joined the Army to serve her country and demonstrate that women could excel in any military role. Instead, her case had become a political symbol that overshadowed the tactical realities of combat operations. The court-martial date was set for 6 weeks after the initial charges, allowing both sides time to prepare their cases and giving media coverage time to reach maximum intensity. Jessica's personal life was scrutinized by reporters looking for details that might explain her actions. Her family received interview requests from national news organizations, and her military records were leaked to journalists willing to pay for inside information. Captain Walsh worked tirelessly to prepare a defense that would focus attention on tactical realities rather than political symbolism. "We're going to put the entire chain of command on trial," she explained during a strategy session. "Every officer who signed off on this mission, every intelligence analyst who provided targeting information, every policymaker who created the conditions that required your split-second decision." The defense strategy aimed to demonstrate that Jessica's actions represented the inevitable result of military policies that placed personnel in impossible situations. Rather than accepting the prosecution's characterization of her shot as reckless, Walsh would argue that it represented exemplary performance under extreme conditions. As the court-martial date approached, Jessica reflected on the path that had brought her from the mountains of Moldanistan to a military courtroom where her career and freedom hung in the balance. The shot that had saved 8 American lives was now being characterized as criminal conduct that threatened military discipline and international law. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same precision and judgment that made her an exceptional sniper were now being portrayed as evidence of unfitness for military service. The institution that had trained her to make life-and-death decisions under pressure was now prosecuting her for making exactly those decisions when they mattered most. The preliminary hearings concluded with Colonel Hayes announcing that the court-martial would proceed as scheduled. Jessica's military career, her freedom, and the future of women in combat operations would be decided by a panel of officers who'd never faced the tactical dilemmas that defined modern warfare. As she left the final pretrial hearing, Jessica understood that the real battle was just beginning. The shot in Moldanistan had taken 2.3 seconds to reach its target. The legal and political consequences of that shot would take months to resolve, and would affect not only her future, but also the opportunities available to every woman who followed her into combat. Parts 6 to 9, The Trial, the military courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk, buzzed with tension as spectators filled every available seat. Jessica Carter sat rigidly beside Captain Amanda Walsh, her dress blue uniform pressed to perfection, her expression controlled despite the media circus surrounding her court-martial. The prosecution table displayed carefully organized exhibits, including enlarged photographs of the Moldanistan compound, ballistic analysis reports, and radio transcripts that would form the foundation of their case against her. Colonel Richard Hayes entered with theatrical precision, his bearing radiating the authority of 30 years in uniform. Behind him walked the members of the court-martial panel, 7 officers whose military careers had been built on strict adherence to protocol and chain of command. Not one had served in the special operations community. Not one had faced the split-second decisions that defined modern combat operations. The lead prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Manning, was a by-the-book military lawyer whose reputation centered on his ability to secure convictions in high-profile cases. He approached the podium with the confidence of someone who believed military discipline trumped tactical considerations under any circumstances. "Members of the court," Manning began, "this case concerns the fundamental principles that separate professional military forces from undisciplined militias. The defendant, Staff Sergeant Jessica Carter, made a conscious decision to ignore established rules of engagement, to override her superior officers, and to take a human life without legal justification. Her actions, regardless of their outcome, represent a dangerous precedent that threatens the very foundation of military order." Manning walked to the exhibit table and lifted a photograph of the Moldanistan village where Al-Rashid had died. On the morning in question, Sergeant Carter was ordered to provide overwatch and reconnaissance support to SEAL Team Bravo. Her role was clearly defined: observe, report, and engage only upon specific authorization with positive target identification. Instead, she chose to become judge, jury, and executioner based on her personal assessment of tactical necessity. The prosecution's opening statement continued for 40 minutes, painting Jessica as a rogue operator whose emotional attachment to the SEAL team compromised her professional judgment. Manning emphasized the incomplete visual confirmation, the violation of standard protocols, and the precedent her actions might establish for other personnel who decided to override military authority. The government will prove that Sergeant Carter's shot was not the product of tactical necessity, but of personal judgment that placed her individual assessment above established military law. We will demonstrate that her actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, constituted murder in violation of the laws of war because she engaged a target without the legal justification required for lethal force. Captain Walsh rose for the defense, opening with controlled anger evident in her voice. Members of the court, this trial is not about the actions of Staff Sergeant Carter on that mountain ridge in Moldanistan. This trial is about whether we will criminalize the tactical judgment that has made American Special Operations Forces the most effective military units in history. It is about whether we will punish excellence in service of bureaucratic compliance. Walsh approached the court-martial panel with the bearing of a prosecutor rather than a defender. The government wants you to believe that Sergeant Carter acted recklessly, emotionally, outside the bounds of military law. They want you to forget that her shot saved 8 American lives. They want you to ignore that she eliminated a high-value terrorist target who was planning attacks against American personnel. They want you to criminalize the kind of tactical decision-making that has defined American military superiority for generations. The defense strategy became clear as Walsh continued her opening. Rather than accepting the prosecution's framework of rule following versus rule breaking, she would argue that Jessica's actions represented the highest levels of military professionalism applied under extreme circumstances. Sergeant Carter is not a rogue operator who ignored military authority. She is a professional soldier who used her training, experience, and judgment to accomplish the mission while protecting American lives. The shot she fired was not murder. It was precision military action that eliminated a legitimate military target under conditions that demanded immediate response. The first prosecution witness was Major Patricia Reynolds, the SOCAM investigating officer who had conducted the initial inquiry. Manning guided her through a detailed review of Jessica's radio communications, emphasizing every instance where she acknowledged incomplete visual confirmation. Major Reynolds, based on your investigation, did Sergeant Carter have positive visual identification of the target before engaging? No, sir. According to her own statements and radio communications, she acknowledged that visual confirmation remained incomplete according to standard protocols. Manning displayed transcripts of Jessica's radio communications on a large screen visible to the court-martial panel. Can you read for the court Sergeant Carter's exact words at 0847 hours? Reynolds consulted her notes. Quote, target reacquired. Consistent with intelligence parameters, but visual confirmation remains incomplete. End quote. And despite this admission of incomplete visual confirmation, she engaged the target approximately 90 seconds later? Yes, sir. Walsh's cross-examination focused on the tactical realities that Manning had ignored. Major Reynolds, in your investigation, did you interview the members of SEAL Team Bravo who were under fire during this engagement? Yes, ma'am. And what did they tell you about their tactical situation at the time Sergeant Carter engaged the target? Reynolds consulted her files reluctantly. They indicated that their position was becoming untenable and that they faced potential casualties without immediate support. Did any member of the SEAL team suggest that Sergeant Carter's engagement was inappropriate or reckless? No, ma'am. All personnel interviewed expressed gratitude for her actions. Walsh continued pressing on the tactical context that the prosecution preferred to ignore. Major Reynolds, are you familiar with Special Operations rules of engagement for time-sensitive targets? Generally, yes. Are you aware that such rules allow for engagement based on pattern of life, analysis, and circumstantial identification when positive visual confirmation is impossible due to operational constraints? Manning objected to the question as calling for legal conclusions beyond the witness's expertise, but Colonel Hayes allowed Reynolds to answer. I am aware that Special Operations Forces operate under modified rules of engagement for certain target categories. The testimony continued for 2 days as the prosecution built their case around Jessica's failure to follow standard identification protocols. They called communications experts who analyzed radio transmissions, intelligence analysts who testified about target identification requirements, and policy experts who explained the legal frameworks governing lethal force. Each witness reinforced the prosecution's central theme. Military effectiveness depended upon strict adherence to established procedures, regardless of battlefield conditions. Jessica's decision to engage without complete visual confirmation represented a dangerous precedent that could lead to civilian casualties and diplomatic incidents. The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a military psychologist, who testified about decision-making under stress and the psychological factors that might influence personnel in combat situations. Manning guided her through testimony designed to support gender-based assumptions about Jessica's actions. Dr. Hoffman, in your research on stress responses in combat personnel, have you identified differences between male and female subjects in terms of emotional decision-making? Walsh immediately objected to the question as irrelevant and prejudicial, but Hayes allowed it after Manning argued that psychological factors were relevant to understanding Jessica's decision-making process. Research has indicated that female personnel may be more likely to prioritize relational factors in decision-making under stress, potentially leading to choices based on emotional rather than tactical considerations. The testimony was devastating because it provided scientific-sounding justification for gender stereotypes that portrayed women as emotionally unreliable under pressure. Manning spent nearly an hour having Hoffman explain her research, emphasizing conclusions that supported the prosecution's theory about Jessica's motivations. Walsh's cross-examination revealed the limitations of Hoffman's research and its irrelevance to Jessica's specific circumstances. Dr. Hoffman, how many female snipers have you studied in your research? The sample size for female precision marksmen was necessarily limited due to their small numbers in combat roles. How many specifically? Hoffman consulted her notes reluctantly. 12 individuals over a 3-year period. And how many of those 12 had experience comparable to Sergeant Carter's background and training? None had equivalent special operations experience. Walsh continued dismantling Hoffman's testimony by demonstrating that her research was based on laboratory simulations rather than actual combat conditions. Dr. Hoffman, have you ever been in a combat situation where American lives depended on your split-second decision-making? No, ma'am. Have you ever fired a weapon in combat? No, ma'am. Yet you're offering opinions about the psychological factors that influenced a decorated combat veteran's tactical decisions under enemy fire. Manning objected, but the damage was done. Walsh had exposed the prosecution's psychological testimony as academic speculation rather than relevant expertise. The prosecution concluded their case with testimony from Colonel James Morrison, a senior infantry officer who had opposed gender integration throughout his career. Morrison testified about the importance of military discipline and the dangers of allowing personnel to override established authority. The military is not a democracy, Morrison declared. It is a hierarchical organization that depends upon immediate, unquestioning obedience to lawful orders. When individual soldiers decide they know better than their commanding officers, the entire structure of military effectiveness breaks down. Manning used Morrison's testimony to argue that Jessica's actions represented exactly the kind of independent thinking that made women unsuitable for combat roles. Colonel Morrison, in your opinion, do Sergeant Carter's actions demonstrate the kind of tactical judgment we should expect from personnel in life-and-death situations? Absolutely not. Military operations require personnel who follow orders and trust their chain of command. Personal initiative, while admirable in some contexts, becomes dangerous when it overrides established procedures and legal constraints. The prosecution rested their case after 4 days of testimony, confident that they had established both the legal and practical arguments for conviction. Jessica had violated established protocols, engaged a target without positive identification, and demonstrated the kind of independent action that threatened military discipline. Captain Walsh opened the defense case by calling Lieutenant Commander Marcus Stone as her first witness. Stone entered the courtroom in dress whites, his bearing reflecting the confidence of a combat leader who had operated in the world's most dangerous environments. Commander Stone, please describe your experience with Staff Sergeant Carter during Special Operations missions. Sergeant Carter has provided Overwatch support for 6 DEVGRU missions over the past 8 months. Her performance has been exceptional. In every instance, she has demonstrated tactical judgment, technical competence, and professional reliability that exceeds most personnel I've worked with during 15 years in Special Operations. Walsh guided Stone through a detailed description of the Moldanistan operation, emphasizing the tactical constraints and time pressures that influenced Jessica's decision-making. Commander Stone, in your assessment as the ground force commander, was Sergeant Carter's engagement tactically justified? Absolutely. Based on available intelligence, target behavior patterns, and the immediate threat to American personnel, her decision to engage represented sound tactical judgment under extremely difficult circumstances. Manning's cross-examination attempted to portray Stone as biased due to his personal relationship with Jessica and his investment in defending the mission's outcome. Commander Stone, isn't it true that you have a personal interest in defending Sergeant Carter's actions because they saved your team? Stone's response cut through Manning's implication with military precision. Sir, I have a professional interest in accurate assessment of tactical performance. Sergeant Carter's engagement was consistent with Special Operations doctrine and the tactical requirements of the situation. The defense continued with testimony from Danny Brooks and other SEAL team members who had been under fire during Jessica's engagement. Each witness emphasized the deteriorating tactical situation and the immediate threat they faced without precision fire support. Brooks was particularly effective in describing the moment when Jessica's shot eliminated the target. "Ma'am, we were taking effective fire from multiple positions and running low on ammunition. When Sergeant Carter's round impacted, the entire enemy position went silent. That shot directly saved American lives." Walsh used the SEAL testimony to establish that Jessica's decision was not emotional or reckless, but was instead the product of professional assessment and tactical necessity. The men she had supported universally praised her judgment and expressed gratitude for her actions. The defense's expert witness was Colonel David Patterson, a retired Special Operations officer with extensive experience in similar tactical situations. Patterson testified about the realities of modern combat operations and the requirements for rapid decision-making under incomplete information. The prosecution seems to believe that combat operations can be conducted according to peacetime legal standards, Patterson explained. In reality, Special Operations personnel must frequently make life and death decisions based on incomplete information and tactical judgment. This is not a failure of the system. It is how the system is designed to work. Patterson's testimony provided professional context for Jessica's actions that the prosecution had ignored. He explained how intelligence analysis, pattern recognition, and tactical assessment combined to create reasonable certainty, even when complete visual confirmation was impossible. In my assessment, Sergeant Carter's engagement met every reasonable standard for tactical judgment under combat conditions. Her decision was based on professional training, available intelligence, and the immediate requirements of the mission. Manning's cross-examination of Patterson focused on the legal Requirements for lethal force, and the importance of positive target identification in preventing civilian casualties. Colonel Patterson, don't you agree that positive visual identification is required to comply with the laws of armed conflict? When possible, yes. But the laws of armed conflict also recognize military necessity and the requirements for immediate action to protect friendly forces. Sergeant Carter's engagement clearly fell within those parameters. The defense case concluded with Jessica's own testimony, the moment that would determine whether the court-martial panel saw her as a professional soldier or a rogue operator. Walsh guided her through a methodical review of her training, experience, and the specific factors that influenced her decision in Moldanistan. Staff Sergeant Carter, please describe your thought process during the 90 seconds between your radio communication acknowledging incomplete visual confirmation and your decision to engage the target. Jessica's answer had been rehearsed extensively, but her delivery carried the authenticity of lived experience. Ma'am, I continued to gather available intelligence through multiple sensory inputs. The target's positioning, movement patterns, and tactical behavior were all consistent with intelligence parameters for Al-Rashid. The threat to American personnel was immediate and severe. Based on my training and experience, I assessed that the probability of correct target identification was sufficient to justify engagement under the tactical constraints of the situation. Walsh spent 2 hours having Jessica explain the technical aspects of her decision-making, demonstrating that her engagement was the product of professional judgment rather than emotional reaction. Jessica described the ballistic calculations, environmental factors, and tactical considerations that influenced her shot placement and timing. The prosecution has suggested that your decision was influenced by emotional attachment to the SEAL team. How do you respond to that characterization? Ma'am, my decision was based on tactical assessment and military necessity. Personal relationships played no role in my evaluation of engagement criteria. I would have made the same decision regardless of which American unit was at risk. Manning's cross-examination was brutal and lasted nearly 3 hours. He attacked every aspect of Jessica's testimony, challenging her technical explanations, questioning her motivations, and attempting to portray her as an individual who believed herself above military authority. Staff Sergeant Carter, you acknowledged over the radio that visual confirmation remained incomplete, yet you fired anyway. How is that different from random shooting into a building where you hope the right person might be present? Jessica's response reflected months of preparation with her defense team. Sir, the engagement was not random. It was based on intelligence analysis, pattern recognition, tactical positioning, and threat assessment. These factors, combined with my training and experience, provided reasonable certainty for engagement under combat conditions. Manning continued pressing, attempting to force Jessica into admitting that she had violated established procedures. But you did violate standard protocols for positive target identification, didn't you? Sir, I followed special operations rules of engagement for time-sensitive targets under tactical constraints. My engagement was consistent with established doctrine for the operational environment. The cross-examination revealed the fundamental disagreement underlying the entire case. Manning represented institutional priorities that emphasize procedural compliance and legal protection. Jessica represented operational realities that demanded tactical flexibility and professional judgment. As the testimony concluded, both sides prepared for closing arguments that would determine not only Jessica's fate, but also the precedent for future operations involving female combat personnel. The court-martial panel would deliberate on questions that went far beyond the specifics of one engagement in a remote mountain valley. The trial had become a referendum on military effectiveness versus bureaucratic compliance, on professional judgment versus institutional authority, and on the capabilities of women in combat roles. Jessica's shot had taken 2.3 seconds to reach its target in Moldanistan. The legal and political consequences would reshape military policy for generations. Parts 10 to 14. The Reckoning. The court-martial panel deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Jessica Carter stood at attention beside Captain Amanda Walsh, her face betraying nothing of the turmoil churning inside her chest. The 7 officers who would determine her fate filed back into the courtroom with expressions carved from granite, their decisions sealed behind military bearing that revealed nothing. Colonel Richard Hayes called the court to order with ceremonial gravity. Has the panel reached findings on the charges and specifications? The panel president, Brigadier General Thomas Crawford, rose with the weight of institutional authority. We have, sir. Please announce your findings. Crawford consulted the written verdict with theatrical precision. On the specification of Article 118, murder in violation of the law of war, we find the accused guilty. On the specification of Article 86, failure to obey a lawful order, we find the accused guilty. On the specification of Article 134, conduct of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces, we find the accused guilty. The words struck Jessica like physical blows. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The panel had rejected every aspect of her defense, every argument about tactical necessity, every testimony about her exceptional performance under impossible circumstances. The institution that had trained her to make split-second decisions under fire had now convicted her for making exactly such a decision. Captain Walsh's hand found Jessica's shoulder, a gesture of support that felt inadequate against the magnitude of institutional betrayal. The guilty verdicts meant that Jessica's military career was over, her freedom was in jeopardy, and her future had been decided by officers who had never faced the tactical realities she'd navigated in that mountain valley. Hayes continued the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. The panel will now consider sentencing. The accused has been found guilty of serious violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The panel must determine appropriate punishment that reflects the gravity of these offenses and maintains good order and discipline within the armed forces. The sentencing phase began immediately, with the prosecution calling witnesses who testified about the importance of deterring similar violations. Lieutenant Colonel Manning argued that Jessica's crimes demanded severe punishment to send a message to other personnel who might consider overriding military authority. The defendant's actions represent a fundamental challenge to military discipline, Manning declared. Her conviction must result in punishment severe enough to deter others from similar violations. The integrity of our armed forces depends upon consistent enforcement of legal and moral standards. Captain Walsh fought desperately during the sentencing phase, calling character witnesses who testified about Jessica's exemplary service record, her dedication to protecting American lives, and the exceptional circumstances that had influenced her decision. The defense strategy aimed to secure a punishment that would end Jessica's career without destroying her life entirely. Danny Brooks returned to testify during sentencing, his voice carrying the emotion he'd suppressed during the guilt phase of the trial. "Ma'am, Sergeant Carter saved my life and the lives of 7 other Americans. She made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances, and she made it based on her professional training and her commitment to protecting American personnel. Punishing her for that decision sends a terrible message to the men and women who risked their lives in service to this country." The character testimony continued for hours, with witness after witness describing Jessica's competence, integrity, and dedication. Lieutenant Commander Stone testified about her tactical judgment, fellow Rangers spoke about her leadership, and family members described her lifelong commitment to military service. But the panel's decision had already been made. General Crawford announced the sentence with the same institutional gravity that had marked the entire proceeding. The accused is sentenced to reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 18 months, and dismissal from the United States Army. 18 months in military prison followed by dismissal with a felony conviction that would follow her for the rest of her life. The punishment was designed not just to end Jessica's career, but to serve as a warning to other personnel who might consider similar actions. The military justice system had spoken with finality that would reshape special operations doctrine for years to come. Jessica maintained her composure through the formal announcement, but inside she felt something fundamental break apart. 7 years of exemplary service, 2 combat deployments, dozens of successful missions, the gratitude of the men whose lives she'd saved. None of it had mattered when weighed against institutional priorities that valued compliance over competence. The confinement phase began immediately at the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, a fortress-like institution that housed military personnel convicted of serious crimes. Jessica found herself classified alongside deserters, thieves, and violent criminals, her status as a decorated combat veteran irrelevant within the prison system. The daily routine was designed to break down individual identity and replace it with institutional submission. Morning formations at 0500, assigned labor that ranged from kitchen duty to facility maintenance, educational programs that emphasized respect for authority, and evening confinement in cells that provided minimal privacy or personal space. Jessica adapted to prison life with the same disciplined approach she'd applied to military training. She maintained physical fitness through calisthenics in her cell, read extensively in the prison library, and avoided the conflicts that consumed other inmates. Her goal was simple: survive the 18 months without losing the professional identity that defined her sense of self. The other prisoners initially viewed her with suspicion and curiosity. A female combat veteran convicted of murder was an anomaly in the population, and rumors about her case spread through the facility within days of her arrival. Some inmates saw her as a celebrity, others as a target, most as simply another casualty of military justice. Prison mail brought letters from supporters around the world who had followed her case through media coverage. Veterans organizations condemned her conviction. Women's rights groups cited her case as evidence of institutional discrimination, and military families expressed outrage at the punishment of someone who had saved American lives. But the letters also brought news of the broader consequences of her conviction. Female personnel were being quietly transferred out of combat roles. Special operations units were implementing more restrictive rules of engagement, and the precedent established by her case was being used to justify limitations on women's military service. Jessica's personal sacrifice had become a political symbol that affected thousands of other service members who shared her commitment to military excellence. The conviction that was supposed to deter similar actions had instead created institutional changes that reduced operational effectiveness and professional opportunities for an entire generation of female personnel. The months in confinement passed with grinding routine broken by occasional letters from Captain Walsh, who continued working on an appeal that both women knew was unlikely to succeed. The military appellate system rarely overturned court-martial convictions, particularly in high-profile cases where institutional credibility was at stake. Release came on a cold February morning after Jessica had served 16 months of her sentence. She walked out of Fort Leavenworth carrying a single duffel bag containing her civilian clothes and personal effects, officially dismissed from the Army with a dishonorable discharge that would follow her permanently. Captain Walsh met her at the prison gates, offering a ride to the civilian world that Jessica was struggling to navigate. The appeal was denied, Walsh reported without preamble. The Court of Appeals upheld the conviction on all charges. "I'm sorry, Jessica. We fought as hard as we could." The appeal denial was expected, but it still felt like a final door closing on any possibility of redemption through official channels. Jessica's military career was over, her conviction was permanent, and her future lay in a civilian world that had no use for her particular skills. The transition to civilian life was brutal in ways that military training had never prepared her for. Jessica rented a small apartment in Kansas City, far from military installations where her notoriety might attract unwanted attention. The dishonorable discharge appeared on every job application, triggering automatic rejection from employers who were unwilling to hire convicted felons. Interviews that progressed beyond initial screening inevitably collapsed when potential employers researched her case and discovered the murder conviction. Corporate human resources departments were uncomfortable with the controversy. Security companies were concerned about liability, and even sympathetic employers worried about public relations implications. Jessica's savings from 7 years of military service dwindled rapidly as months passed without steady employment. She worked temporary labor jobs that paid minimum wage and required no background checks, loading trucks for delivery companies and cleaning office buildings during overnight shifts. The work was physically demanding but mindless, providing none of the intellectual challenge or sense of purpose that had defined her military career. Jessica found herself questioning whether the tactical decision that had saved 8 American lives had been worth the personal cost of everything she'd worked to achieve. The isolation was perhaps worse than the financial struggles. Military service had provided not just career identity, but also social connections and institutional belonging. Civilian life offered neither, leaving Jessica adrift in a world where her expertise was not just irrelevant, but actually counterproductive to finding employment. Depression settled over her like a weight that grew heavier each day. The precision and purpose that had defined her professional identity had been replaced by uncertainty and rejection that seemed to confirm the prosecution's characterization of her as someone unfit for responsible positions. Jessica was contemplating more drastic solutions to her situation when the letter arrived. The envelope was expensive paper with no return address, addressed simply to Ms. J. Carter in handwriting. That suggested professional correspondence rather than personal communication. Inside was a single sheet of matching paper and a business card. The letter was brief and intriguing in equal measure. Miss Carter, your reputation precedes you despite recent institutional difficulties. We represent clients who value results over politics and competence over conformity. If you are interested in applying your considerable skills in a more appreciative environment, please contact the number below. As for Mr. Blackwood, compensation begins at $300,000 annually. Sincerely, Victoria Sterling. The business card was elegant but minimal. Blackstone Security International, embossed in gold lettering with a phone number that included too many digits to be domestic. Jessica had heard whispers about Blackstone during her military service, a private security company that operated in the gray areas between government policy and commercial necessity. $300,000 was more money than Jessica had ever imagined earning. Enough to completely rebuild her life and leave the struggles of the past year behind. But she also understood that private military companies didn't pay such salaries for routine security work. They paid for people willing to operate outside the constraints that governed official military forces. Jessica stared at the letter for several minutes before reaching for her phone. The decision felt inevitable given her limited alternatives. But she also recognized that accepting Blackstone's offer would represent a fundamental change in her relationship with the principles that had guided her military service. The voice that answered was crisp and professional, with a slight accent that Jessica couldn't identify. Blackstone Security International, how may I assist you? I'd like to speak with Mr. Blackwood. My name is Jessica Carter. One moment. Please, Miss Carter. Mr. Blackwood is expecting your call. The brief hold was filled with classical music that seemed designed to convey sophistication and discretion. Then a new voice came on the line, male and American with the confident diction of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Miss Carter, thank you for calling. I'm David Blackwood. I trust you received our correspondence regarding potential employment opportunities. I did, though I have to ask how you knew where to find me. Blackwood's laugh carried genuine amusement. We make it our business to track exceptional personnel who have been poorly served by bureaucratic institutions. Your case attracted considerable attention within our community. Jessica understood immediately what he meant. Private military. Companies recruited from the ranks of discharged personnel who possessed valuable skills but had been rejected by official institutions. Her court-martial conviction actually served as a credential within that community, evidence that she was willing to make hard decisions regardless of political consequences. What kind of work are you offering? Jessica asked. Security consultation. For clients operating in challenging environments. Our personnel provide expertise that government forces cannot officially supply due to political constraints or legal limitations. The euphemistic language was familiar from her military experience. Security consultation meant armed operations. Challenging environments meant active conflict zones, and legal limitations meant activities that official forces couldn't acknowledge. Can you be more specific about the operational requirements? Our current contract involves energy infrastructure protection in Eastern Europe. Corporate clients have invested heavily in extraction operations in politically unstable regions. They require security personnel who understand that sometimes the most effective way to prevent conflict is to demonstrate the consequences of initiating it. Jessica walked to her apartment window, looking out at the urban landscape where she'd been struggling to find purpose since her release from confinement. A year ago, she'd been one of the Army's most capable snipers, trusted with million-dollar equipment and life-or-death decisions. Now she was considering whether she could afford next month's rent. What's the timeline for deployment? There's a flight tomorrow evening from Kansas City to Frankfurt, connecting to Tbilisi. Ground transportation from there to the operational area. We would need a decision within the next few hours. Jessica looked around her apartment at the few possessions that represented her current life. Military service had given her identity, purpose, and institutional belonging. The civilian world had offered only rejection and isolation. Blackstone was providing an opportunity to return to work that utilized her skills, even if the context was different from what she'd originally intended. Send me the contract details, she said, already prepared. Check your email within the next 10 minutes. Miss Carter, welcome to Blackstone Security International. The line went dead, leaving Jessica staring at her phone and wondering whether she'd just made the best decision of her life or committed herself to something that would compromise the principles she'd served throughout her military career. The contract was 30 pages of legal language that essentially granted Blackstone complete control over her deployment location, mission parameters, and operational methods. The compensation was real, with a signing bonus that would immediately solve her financial problems and monthly payments that would provide security she'd never experienced. At the bottom of the contract, written in the same elegant script as the recruitment letter, was a personal note. Some situations require personnel who understand that doing right matters more than following rules. We believe you are that kind of professional, V. Sterling. Jessica read the note several times before signing the contract and submitting it through encrypted email systems that suggested Blackstone took operational security seriously. 24 hours later, she was on a commercial flight to Germany, leaving behind the country that had trained her, decorated her, convicted her, and ultimately discarded her. The flight provided time to reflect on the path that had brought her from the mountains of Moldanistan to a private security contract that would deploy her in regions where American forces couldn't officially operate. Her tactical decision to save 8 American lives had cost her everything she'd worked to achieve within official institutions. But as the airplane climbed above the clouds, Jessica realized that her conviction had also liberated her from the bureaucratic constraints that had made that decision so controversial. Private military companies operated under different rules, serving clients who cared more about results than procedures. The question was whether that liberation would allow her to serve American interests more effectively, or whether it would gradually erode the moral principles that had guided her military service. Jessica suspected she would discover the answer. In whatever remote corner of the world Blackstone would send her to apply the skills that had made her both valuable and dangerous. The civilian airplane carried her toward a future where her expertise would be appreciated rather than criminalized, but where the stakes might be higher and the moral complexity even greater than anything she'd faced in official military service. Jessica settled back in her seat and tried to rest, knowing that whatever waited for her in Eastern Europe would test not just her tactical skills, but also her ability to maintain her principles in an environment where they might be seen as luxuries rather than necessities. The Georgian mountains stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced windows of the Blackstone security compound, their snow-capped peaks catching the first light of dawn. Jessica Carter adjusted the focus on her Schmidt Bender scope, conducting the morning surveillance routine that had become as automatic as breathing during her 6 months with the private military company. The Barrett M107A1 felt familiar in her hands, its weight distributed across a custom bipod that Blackstone's armorers had modified for extended operations. The energy facility sprawled across the valley below, a maze of drilling platforms, processing units, and storage tanks that represented Titan Energy Corporation's $3 billion investment in Georgian natural gas extraction. The compound where Jessica maintained Overwatch was positioned on a ridge that provided commanding views of all approach routes while remaining invisible to casual observation from the production facility. Her radio crackled with David Blackwood's voice conducting the morning briefing from the Tactical Operations Center. All stations, intelligence update. Georgian government forces conducted another sweep of the northern border region overnight. No direct contact, but surveillance indicates increased activity from Chechen separatist groups operating across the boundary. Jessica acknowledged the transmission while continuing her systematic scan of assigned sectors. The operational environment in Georgia was complex in ways that made her previous military deployments seem straightforward by comparison. Titan Energy was extracting resources from territory claimed by 3 different ethnic groups, each with historical grievances and modern political aspirations that created shifting patterns of alliance and hostility. Blackstone's role was officially described as facility protection and personnel security, but Jessica had learned that the company's actual mission involved much more sophisticated operations, designed to maintain the delicate balance of local power structures. They weren't just protecting corporate assets. They were managing regional politics through carefully applied pressure and precisely timed interventions. The work was everything that military service had trained her for but hadn't allowed her to do. Blackstone operated without the bureaucratic constraints that had made her tactical decision in Moldanistan so controversial. Rules of engagement were determined by operational necessity rather than political considerations, and personnel were expected to use their professional judgment rather than following rigid protocols. Jessica had initially been assigned to provide long-range precision fire support, the same role she'd performed with DEVGRU operations. But her capabilities had quickly attracted attention from Blackstone's senior leadership, and her responsibilities had expanded to include mission planning, tactical assessment, and direct action operations that utilized the full range of her special operations training. The compound's secure communication system connected her to operations centers in a dozen countries, where Blackstone maintained contracts with energy companies, mining corporations, and governments that required security services beyond what official military forces could provide. Jessica's morning briefings included intelligence updates from Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Venezuela, and Myanmar, a global overview of conflicts that rarely appeared in mainstream news coverage. Victoria Sterling arrived at Jessica's position carrying coffee and encrypted tablets that contained the day's operational priorities. Sterling was Blackstone's regional operations director, a former CIA officer whose career in government service had ended under circumstances that she never discussed. But that had clearly prepared her for private sector work requiring moral flexibility. "Morning, Jessica. How are our Georgian friends behaving today?" Jessica accepted the coffee while maintaining her surveillance routine. "Quiet so far. No movement on the northern approaches, minimal traffic on the access roads. The facilities operating at normal capacity." Sterling consulted her tablets, reviewing intelligence reports that had arrived during the night. "We've got some interesting developments from our sources in Tbilisi. The Georgian government is facing pressure from Moscow to limit Western energy investments. There's talk of new regulations that could affect Titan's operating permits." The information represented the kind of strategic intelligence that Jessica had rarely accessed during her military service. Blackstone's clients paid for comprehensive situational awareness that included not just immediate security threats, but also political and economic factors that might affect long-term operations. "What's our response if the government moves against Titan's permits?" Jessica asked. Sterling smiled with the confidence of someone who had navigated similar crises in other countries. "That's where relationships become important. Blackstone has invested considerable resources in developing contacts within Georgian political and military structures. Sometimes the most effective security measure is ensuring that key decision-makers understand the consequences of unfriendly policies." Jessica understood the implication. Blackstone's security services extended beyond physical protection to include political influence operations that shaped government policies in favor of corporate clients. The company maintained networks of contacts who could be activated to protect client interests through diplomatic, economic, or other forms of pressure. The sophistication of Blackstone's operations was impressive, but it also raised questions about the relationship between corporate interests and national sovereignty that Jessica hadn't fully considered during her military service. American energy companies were essentially using private military contractors to influence foreign government policies in ways that official diplomatic channels couldn't achieve. Sterling continued reviewing the morning intelligence updates, sharing information that revealed the scope of Blackstone's global activities. "Our Nigeria team eliminated a kidnapping threat against ExxonMobil executives yesterday. Clean operation. No official casualties, but the message was received by other groups considering similar actions. Kazakhstan reported successful disruption of pipeline sabotage activities. Myanmar is dealing with increased government pressure on mining operations. But our contacts in the military are managing the situation." Each operational summary represented tactical successes that protected American corporate investments and personnel, but they also demonstrated how private military companies were conducting foreign policy through direct action rather than traditional diplomatic processes. Blackstone was essentially a parallel military force that served commercial rather than national interests. "Speaking of tactical successes," Sterling said, "I've got your next assignment. High-priority mission that specifically requested your particular skills." Jessica lowered her rifle and turned her attention to Sterling's briefing materials. After 6 months of facility protection duties, she was ready for operational challenges that would utilize her full range of capabilities. "We've got a situation in Chechnya that requires precision resolution. A separatist leader named Aslan Maskadov has been coordinating attacks against energy infrastructure throughout the region. Russian forces have been unsuccessful in eliminating him due to political constraints and operational limitations." Sterling handed Jessica a tablet containing detailed intelligence files on Maskadov, including photographs, behavioral analysis, and operational patterns developed through extensive surveillance. Maskadov is currently operating from a compound approximately 15 kilometers from the Georgian border. The location is heavily defended and positioned in terrain that makes conventional assault extremely difficult. Jessica studied the intelligence materials, immediately recognizing the tactical challenges involved in engaging a target in such a remote and well-defended position. What's the operational timeline? 72 hours. Maskadov is planning to relocate to a different area where access will be even more limited. This represents our best opportunity to eliminate him before he disappears into the mountain networks. The mission parameters were familiar from Jessica's military experience, but the context was fundamentally different. Instead of serving American strategic interests under official military authority, she would be eliminating a target who threatened corporate energy operations under private contractor authorization. What about official Russian military operations? In the area, are we coordinating with government forces? Sterling's expression revealed the complexity of the operational environment. The Russians are officially unaware of our activities. Plausible deniability is essential for all parties involved. If the mission succeeds, Maskadov's death will be attributed to internal separatist conflicts rather than external intervention. Jessica understood the implications. Blackstone was conducting assassination operations in foreign countries without official government authorization or oversight. The mission would be completely deniable, with no official record of American involvement or corporate responsibility. What are the rules of engagement? Eliminate the primary target using methods that cannot be traced to American or Georgian sources. Minimize collateral damage to avoid international attention, but mission success takes priority over all other considerations. The instructions were clear and professionally familiar, but they also represented a fundamental departure from the legal and moral frameworks that had governed Jessica's military service. She would be conducting an assassination in a foreign country based on corporate rather than national security interests. Sterling seemed to recognize Jessica's hesitation. I know this is different from military operations you've conducted previously. Private sector work requires different moral calculations than government service. But the result is the same, protecting American interests and personnel from hostile forces. Jessica considered the mission parameters while reviewing intelligence. Materials that revealed the extent of Maskadov's operations against energy infrastructure. The separatist leader had coordinated attacks that killed dozens of workers and caused millions of dollars in damage to facilities that provided energy resources to European markets. What happens if the operation goes wrong? If I'm captured or killed in Chechen territory? Blackstone maintains comprehensive contingency plans for personnel recovery and family support. But realistically, operations at this level rarely result. In conventional capture scenarios, you either complete the mission successfully or you don't come back. The brutal honesty was refreshing compared to military briefings that often obscured operational realities behind euphemistic language. Sterling was acknowledging that Jessica would be completely isolated in hostile territory, with no official support or legal protection if something went wrong. I'll need detailed terrain analysis, updated weather forecasts, and escape route planning, Jessica said, accepting the mission despite her reservations about its broader implications. Sterling smiled with satisfaction. All available in your operational folder. Transportation to the staging area begins at 1800 hours. You'll be working with a local support team that has experience in cross-border operations. Jessica spent the remainder of the day preparing equipment and studying intelligence materials that revealed the tactical challenges involved in eliminating a target who had survived multiple assassination attempts by Russian special forces. Maskadov was clearly a professional operator who understood the security requirements for surviving in a hostile environment. The Barrett M107A1 would be inadequate for the operational requirements, which demanded a weapon system capable of extreme long-range precision while remaining portable enough for solo infiltration. Blackstone's armory provided a Barrett M107A1 intervention rifle chambered in .408 caliber, a precision system capable of engaging targets beyond 2,500 meters under optimal conditions. The support team consisted of 3 Georgian nationals with extensive experience in cross-border operations and detailed knowledge of Chechen terrain and security procedures. Their leader, a former Georgian military officer named Georgi Baratashvili, briefed Jessica on infiltration routes and extraction plans that would allow her to reach the target area undetected. Maskadov's compound is positioned on high ground, with clear sightlines in all directions, Baratashvili explained, using topographical maps to illustrate the tactical challenges. The only viable shooting position is from a ridge approximately 1,800 meters northwest of the target building. The approach requires 8 kilometers of movement through territory controlled by separatist patrols. Jessica studied the operational plan, recognizing that the mission would require everything she'd learned about long-range marksmanship, fieldcraft, and survival in hostile environments. Success would depend not only on her shooting ability, but also on her capacity to infiltrate and exfiltrate through enemy territory without detection. The infiltration began at midnight, with Jessica and the support team crossing the Georgian border through mountain passes that had been used by smugglers and guerrilla fighters for centuries. The terrain was brutal, requiring careful navigation through rocky ground that could easily cause ankle injuries or equipment damage. Jessica carried the Chaitak rifle system broken down in a mountain pack that also contained advanced optics, ballistic computation equipment, and enough supplies to sustain independent operations for several days. The total weight exceeded 60 pounds, but her physical conditioning allowed her to maintain the pace required to reach the shooting position before dawn. The movement took 6 hours through territory that showed evidence of recent military activity. Abandoned fighting positions, discarded equipment, and impact craters from artillery strikes revealed the intensity of ongoing conflicts that rarely received international media attention. Jessica's shooting position was a natural depression in the ridgeline that provided concealment from multiple directions while allowing clear line of sight to Maskadov's compound. The range was precisely 1,847 meters according to her laser measurement system, well within the Chaitak's effective engagement envelope, but requiring careful calculation of environmental factors. The compound appeared through her scope as a collection of stone buildings surrounded by defensive positions and vehicle parks. Intelligence had indicated that Maskadov maintained a regular schedule that included morning briefings in the main building's second-floor conference room, providing a predictable opportunity for engagement. Jessica settled into her shooting position as the sun began to rise over the Chechen mountains, casting long shadows that would affect visibility and target identification. The morning temperature was dropping, which would increase air density and require ballistic adjustments to compensate for altered bullet trajectory. Through her thermal scope, she could see activity beginning within the compound as personnel began their daily routines. Guards changed shifts, vehicles moved between buildings, and smoke rose from cooking fires that indicated normal operational activities. At 0847 hours, figures appeared in the second-floor window of the main building, silhouetted against interior lighting that made identification possible through advanced optics. Jessica recognized Maskadov immediately from intelligence photographs, his distinctive height and posture unmistakable even at extreme range. The separatist leader was conducting what appeared to be a tactical briefing with several subordinates, pointing to maps and documents spread across a conference table. Jessica could see his face clearly through the scope's magnification, confirming beyond doubt that she had acquired the correct target. Wind conditions were optimal, with steady air movement from the southeast at 8 knots. Temperature had stabilized, and atmospheric pressure readings indicated stable ballistic conditions. Jessica had perhaps 10 minutes before Maskadov would conclude his briefing and move to a different location. She settled into the meditative state that preceded every important shot, controlling her breathing and heart rate while making final calculations for windage and elevation. At 1,847 meters, the 408 caliber round would require approximately 2.8 seconds to reach the target, carrying sufficient kinetic energy to eliminate any human target with a center mass hit. Jessica's finger found the trigger as she settled the crosshairs on Maskadov's center mass. The separatist leader was clearly visible through the window, his attention focused on operational planning rather than security procedures that might have saved his life. The trigger broke cleanly, sending the precision round screaming across the mountain valley with ballistic perfection that represented years of training and months of preparation. Jessica immediately chambered another round and reacquired the target through her scope, following standard procedures for confirming successful engagement. Through the compound's window, she could see the impact results. Maskadov had been thrown backward against the far wall, his body motionless while his subordinates scrambled for cover and shouted commands that carried clearly across the distance. "Target eliminated," Jessica reported through her encrypted communication system. "Clean hit, confirmed kill." The extraction began immediately, with Jessica disassembling her rifle system and preparing for the movement back to Georgian territory. The compound below was erupting into activity as separatist forces attempted to locate the shooter, but their search patterns were focused in the wrong directions. Jessica and her support team reached the border crossing 6 hours later, successfully, completing an operation that had eliminated a significant threat to energy infrastructure while maintaining complete deniability for all parties involved. Maskadov's death would be attributed to internal separatist conflicts, and no evidence would connect the assassination to American corporate interests or private military contractors. The mission represented everything that private military work offered: operational freedom, professional satisfaction, substantial compensation, and the ability to eliminate threats without bureaucratic constraints or political oversight. Jessica had accomplished in one day what Russian military forces had failed to achieve through months of conventional operations. But as she rode back toward the Blackstone compound, Jessica also reflected on the moral complexity of her new profession. She was no longer serving American national interests under constitutional authority and military law. She was conducting assassination operations for corporate clients who valued profit margins more than democratic principles or international law. The tactical decision that had ended her military career had been based on protecting American lives under combat conditions. This mission had been based on protecting corporate investments under commercial conditions. The skills required were identical, but the moral framework was fundamentally different. Jessica's expertise was now available to the highest bidder rather than to the country that had trained her and the Constitution she had sworn to defend. Private military work provided professional fulfillment and financial security, but it also represented a form of mercenary service that prioritized economic interests over national values. As the Georgian mountains disappeared behind her, Jessica understood that she had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. She was no longer an American soldier serving her country's interests. She was a private contractor serving whoever was willing to pay for her particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. The court-martial that had ended her military career had been unjust, but it had also forced her to discover alternatives that were perhaps more honest about the relationship between violence and economic interests. Private military companies openly acknowledged that they served corporate rather than national purposes, while official military forces often obscured similar relationships behind patriotic rhetoric. Jessica's future lay in operations that would take her to remote corners of the world, where corporate interests required protection from local populations who opposed foreign resource extraction. She would apply her exceptional skills in service of profit rather than principle, effectiveness rather than ethics, success rather than service. The transformation was complete. Staff Sergeant Jessica Carter, decorated Army Ranger and convicted war criminal, had become Ms. J. Carter, private military contractor and corporate asset. The shot that had saved 8 American lives had ultimately led her to a profession where American lives mattered only insofar as they affected quarterly earnings reports. The secure satellite phone in Jessica's tactical vest buzzed as the extraction vehicle approached the Blackstone compound. Victoria Sterling's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded attention despite the encrypted connection's slight delay. "Jessica, we need you back at headquarters immediately." Priority Alpha tasking just came down from corporate leadership. "How quickly can you be operational?" Jessica checked her watch, calculating recovery time from the cross-border operation. That had just concluded successfully. "Give me 6 hours for equipment maintenance and mission debrief." "What's the operational requirement?" "Can't discuss details over comms, but this one comes directly from the board of directors." Compensation package reflects the sensitivity. We're talking about a 7-figure contract for the right person. 7 figures represented more money than Jessica had imagined possible during her military service, but she'd learned that Blackstone's highest-paying contracts usually involve the greatest risks and moral complexity. Assignments that commanded such compensation typically required operations that crossed legal or ethical boundaries that conventional military forces couldn't approach. The Blackstone Compound's operations center was buzzing with activity when Jessica arrived for her priority briefing. Multiple screens displayed satellite imagery, intelligence reports, and financial data that suggested a corporate crisis requiring immediate tactical response. David Blackwood waited in the secure conference room alongside 2 individuals Jessica didn't recognize, their expensive suits and nervous demeanor identifying them as client representatives rather than operational personnel. "Jessica, meet Robert Harrison and Janet Chun from Titan Energy's Executive Security Division," Blackwood said without preamble. "They're here because their company is facing a situation that requires your specific capabilities." Harrison was a corporate lawyer whose soft appearance contrasted sharply with the hardened military contractors who usually occupied Blackstone briefing rooms. Chun appeared to be a security consultant, probably former government service-based, on her alertness and professional bearing, but clearly someone whose experience centered on corporate rather than combat environments. "Ms. Carter," Harrison began nervously, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of corporate security. Titan Energy has discovered that one of our senior executives has been providing sensitive information to environmental activists and foreign intelligence services. The situation requires immediate resolution to prevent catastrophic damage to our global operations." Jessica understood immediately that she was being briefed on an assassination mission targeting an American citizen on American soil. The corporate euphemisms couldn't disguise the reality that Titan Energy wanted someone killed to protect their business interests from whistleblowing activities. "Who's the target and what information are we protecting?" Jessica asked, maintaining professional composure despite her growing unease about the mission parameters. Chun consulted encrypted tablets that contained intelligence materials too sensitive for digital transmission. Dr. Michael Patterson, Titan's former Director of Environmental Assessment. Patterson has been secretly documenting environmental violations at our extraction sites worldwide. He's preparing to release this information to international media organizations and regulatory agencies. The intelligence files revealed that Patterson had spent 15 years documenting Titan Energy's systematic violation of environmental regulations, worker safety standards, and indigenous rights protections. His evidence included internal communication showing corporate leadership's awareness of these violations and their deliberate decisions to continue operations despite known risks to human health and environmental stability. Patterson's disclosures would result in criminal charges against senior executives, regulatory sanctions that could shut down multiple extraction sites, and civil liability exceeding $20 billion, Harrison explained with the clinical precision of someone calculating financial rather than human costs. The company cannot survive the revelation of this information. Jessica studied Patterson's file, noting that he was a distinguished environmental scientist with 3 decades of experience in energy sector assessment. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation was spotless, and his documentation appeared to be comprehensive and legally devastating for Titan Energy. "What's the timeline for his planned disclosure?" Jessica asked. "Intelligence indicates." Patterson has scheduled meetings with Washington Post reporters and Senate Environment Committee staff within the next 72 hours, Chun replied. Once he provides his evidence to media or government officials, the information becomes impossible to contain. Blackwood activated wall-mounted screens that displayed Patterson's current location, a remote cabin in the Montana wilderness where the scientist was apparently preparing his final documentation for release. The target is currently isolated, approximately 200 kilometers from the nearest law enforcement facility. Terrain provides excellent concealment for long-range engagement and multiple escape routes for post-mission extraction. Jessica realized that Blackstone had already conducted detailed surveillance and mission planning for Patterson's assassination. The briefing wasn't asking whether she would accept the contract. It was presenting operational parameters for a mission that corporate leadership had already authorized. What about Patterson's family? Does he have dependents who might continue his work? Harrison's expression revealed the thoroughness of corporate risk assessment. Patterson's wife died 2 years ago. His adult children live overseas and have no involvement in his environmental research. Elimination of the primary target would effectively neutralize the threat to company operations. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality that Jessica was being asked to murder an American scientist whose crime was documenting corporate violations of environmental and safety regulations. Patterson wasn't a terrorist or foreign agent. He was a whistleblower whose evidence threatened Titan Energy's profit margins. I need detailed intelligence on Patterson's security precautions and daily routine, Jessica said, recognizing that her questions were being interpreted as acceptance of the mission despite her internal reservations. Chun provided encrypted files containing weeks of surveillance data on Patterson's activities. Target maintains minimal security awareness. No bodyguards, no defensive measures, no indication that he suspects he's under surveillance. He follows a predictable routine that includes morning walks along marked trails approximately 800 meters from his cabin. The intelligence revealed that Patterson was completely vulnerable to precision engagement from concealed positions that would allow Jessica to eliminate him without risk of detection or capture. The environmental scientist was an easy target, whose death could be attributed to hunting accidents or random violence rather than corporate assassination. Blackwood presented the financial terms with the matter-of-fact delivery he used for all high-value contracts. $2 million upon successful completion, with additional performance bonuses based on mission execution standards. Full operational support including equipment, transportation, and extraction resources. Legal protection through Blackstone's corporate structure and international law firm partnerships. $2 million represented financial security that would allow Jessica to retire from private military work and establish a completely new identity in any country that didn't extradite American citizens. The compensation reflected not just the mission's difficulty, but also the moral compromise required to eliminate an American scientist whose documentation threatened corporate interests. I need 12 hours to review operational parameters and finalize mission planning, Jessica said, accepting the assignment despite profound reservations about targeting someone whose only crime was revealing the truth about corporate environmental violations. The Montana wilderness was spectacular in ways that reminded Jessica of childhood camping trips with her family. Back when the world seemed simpler and her biggest worry was whether she'd catch fish for dinner. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now planning to kill someone in terrain that represented everything pure and unspoiled about the American landscape. Patterson's cabin was positioned in a valley surrounded by forested ridgelines that provided multiple concealed shooting positions within effective range. Jessica's reconnaissance revealed that the environmental scientist maintained the predictable routine surveillance had documented, beginning each day with solitary walks along trails that had been carved by generations of wildlife. The mission plan was tactically straightforward but morally complex in ways that made Jessica question fundamental assumptions about her post-military career. She'd accepted that private military work involved serving corporate rather than national interests. But eliminating American citizens on American soil crossed boundaries that she hadn't previously considered. Patterson appeared through her scope precisely on schedule, walking slowly along the forest trail while observing wildlife and taking photographs of wildflowers. He moved with the careful attention of someone who genuinely appreciated natural beauty, stopping frequently to document species and environmental conditions. Through her optics, Jessica could see that Patterson was elderly, probably in his 60s, with the careful movements of someone whose physical capabilities were declining. With age, he wore hiking clothes that suggested genuine outdoor experience rather than corporate affectation, and his behavior indicated someone who found peace and purpose in natural environments. The range was 847 meters, well within Jessica's effective engagement envelope and similar to the shot that had ended her military career. Environmental conditions were optimal, with minimal wind and clear visibility that would ensure precision engagement. Patterson's predictable route provided multiple opportunities for clean shots that would eliminate him instantly. Jessica's training had emphasized the importance of positive target identification before engaging, but Patterson's appearance and behavior left no doubt about his identity. She was tracking the right person at the right location according to intelligence that had proven accurate in every detail. But as she settled into her shooting position, Jessica found herself hesitating in ways that were completely foreign to her professional experience. Patterson represented everything that was admirable about American scientific tradition: intellectual honesty, moral courage, and commitment to protecting public welfare, even when it conflicted with powerful interests. The environmental scientist was walking slowly through the forest, completely unaware that corporate interests had sentenced him to death for revealing the truth about their operations. His documentation would expose violations that affected millions of people living near Titan energy extraction sites, but his death would ensure that this information never reached regulatory agencies or news organizations. Jessica's finger found the trigger as Patterson paused to photograph a flowering plant beside the trail. The crosshairs settled on center mass of a target who had devoted his career to protecting environmental resources from the kind of corporate exploitation that now demanded his elimination. Through her scope, she could see Patterson's face clearly as he concentrated on capturing the perfect image of natural beauty that would soon be destroyed by energy extraction operations. His expression reflected the wonder and appreciation that had probably motivated his entire career in environmental science. The moral weight of the engagement began to override Jessica's professional conditioning. Patterson wasn't a terrorist or enemy combatant. He was an American scientist whose research threatened corporate profits rather than national security. Killing him would protect Titan Energy's financial interests while ensuring that environmental violations continued to harm communities worldwide. Jessica's breathing slowed as she entered the meditative state that preceded important shots, but her finger remained on the trigger's first stage rather than completing the engagement sequence. Patterson continued his walk, unaware that his life hung in the balance of a decision that would define Jessica's moral identity for the remainder of her career. The satellite phone in her vest buzzed with an encrypted message from Blackstone Operations. Target acquisition confirmed. Authorization to engage at your discretion. Time is critical. Jessica understood that corporate leadership was monitoring her position and expecting immediate mission completion. Patterson would conclude his morning walk within the next few minutes, returning to his cabin where he would continue preparing documentation that would expose decades of environmental crimes. Through her scope, she watched Patterson stop to rest on a fallen log, consulting field notes that probably contained observations about species diversity and habitat quality. His research represented the kind of scientific documentation that environmental protection laws were designed to encourage, but corporate interests now demanded his death to prevent this information from reaching public attention. Jessica made her choice. She removed her finger from the trigger and began disassembling her rifle system, preparing for extraction without completing the mission that would have made her a multimillionaire but would also have made her a murderer of American scientists whose crime was revealing the truth. The encrypted satellite phone rang within minutes of her decision to abort the mission. Victoria Sterling's voice carried barely controlled anger mixed with professional disappointment. "Jessica, we show no engagement. What's your status?" "Mission aborted. Target does not present legitimate threat requiring lethal response. Returning to base for debriefing." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Sterling responded with the cold professionalism that characterized Blackstone's approach to personnel who failed to meet corporate expectations. "Understood. Report to operations immediately upon return. Senior leadership will require detailed explanation of mission failure." Jessica understood that her refusal to kill Patterson had probably ended her relationship with Blackstone Security International. Private military companies demanded absolute reliability from contractors who accepted high-value assignments, and her moral objections to the mission would be seen as professional failure rather than ethical courage. The extraction journey provided time to reflect on the path that had brought her from decorated military service to corporate assassination missions targeting American citizens. Her court-martial had been unjust, but it had also forced her to choose between serving institutional interests and following moral principles that transcended organizational loyalty. The decision to refuse Patterson's assassination represented a return to the values that had originally motivated her military service: protecting innocent people rather than powerful interests, serving truth rather than profit, and maintaining moral principles even when they conflicted with professional advancement or financial gain. Jessica realized that her true enemy had never been military prosecutors who questioned her tactical decisions or private military companies that offered lucrative contracts for morally questionable missions. Her enemy was the institutional corruption that transformed patriotic service into corporate profit and reduced human lives to variables in financial calculations. As she approached the Blackstone compound for what would probably be her final briefing, Jessica understood that her career as a private military contractor was ending just as her military career had ended, with a principled refusal to follow orders that violated her moral code. The difference was that this time, she was making the choice voluntarily rather than being forced into it by bureaucratic prosecution. Jessica had discovered that there were some missions that no amount of money could justify, some targets that no corporate interest could legitimize, and some moral boundaries that professional success couldn't cross. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.